The fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped wasps over Trauma Bay 3 at Mercy General. Elena Martinez didn't hear them anymore. After 15 years, the hum became white noise, part of the hospital's heartbeat, same as the monitors beeping their electronic pulse, same as the ventilator's wheeze and release that filled the San Diego emergency room at 3:47 in the morning. Captain Ray Holland arrived unconscious, his left arm swelling to twice its normal size. The skin had gone waxy and tight, stretched thin over a forearm that had been crushed under a Humvee during a training accident at Camp Pendleton. His name was on his intake card. His rank was on his uniform. His vital signs were on the monitor: heart rate 148, climbing. Blood pressure 92/58 and falling. O2 sat 84%. The on-call surgeon was 20 minutes out. Maybe 22. Elena's hands were already moving before the attending physician finished giving orders. She'd moved this way for so long that her body no longer consulted her brain about what came next. Muscle memory wasn't a request. It was law. "Get me 2 18-gauge lines," she said, her voice the color of smoke, present but somehow invisible. The junior nurse, Marcus, was new. 3 weeks into his rotation. He was fast. That was good. She didn't have time for hesitation. "Vitals dropping," he said. The monitor agreed. 82% oxygen. The number kept sliding down like water through a sieve. The compartment syndrome was obvious from the moment she looked at the arm. The pressure inside the fascial compartment was rising, squeezing off blood flow, starving the muscle tissue. In another few minutes, the cellular death would become permanent. In another 10, the whole limb would be dead. A ranger captain with 15 years of service would wake up without an arm, or wouldn't wake up at all. Dr. Chen, the attending, stood at the foot of the stretcher with his arms crossed. "Surgeon's 8 minutes out now. We hold and stabilize." Elena didn't stop moving. She was already positioning the ultrasound probe over the compartment, already reading the dark spaces inside the swelling tissue where fluid had begun replacing blood. The machine screen glowed cold blue in the dim room. 8 minutes, she said quietly. "Compartment pressure at this rate of necrosis, we lose the limb in 6. Then we lose the limb," Dr. Chen said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had learned to make peace with impossible choices. "We don't have surgical credentials in here, Elena. We have a protocol." The rain had started outside the bay windows, not rain that fell, but rain that attacked, hammering against the glass like something angry trying to get in. Thunder rolled across the city, and the lights flickered once. Just once. Long enough to remind everyone how thin the walls were between order and chaos. Elena moved to her locker. It was in the supply room, 3rd tier, behind the boxes of saline bags and the rolls of elastic tape. She'd placed the trauma shears there 5 years ago, wrapped in a cloth the color of old blood. The cloth was soft now, worn at the edges from her hands touching it at 3 in the morning, at 2, at 4:15, whenever the weight of who she used to be got too heavy to carry. The shears were made of German stainless steel. The handles had been formed in her hand so many times that they fit her grip like they'd been grown for her specifically. And engraved into the steel, in letters so small most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for them, were 2 words, Reaper 6. She didn't look at those words. She hadn't looked at them in 4 years. She was back in Trauma Bay 3 in 19 seconds. "What are you doing?" Dr. Chen's voice had changed. It had sharpened into something harder to ignore. "The patient will lose motor function in the hand within 7 minutes, Elena said. She was already moving Captain Holland's arm toward the light, already positioning the ultrasound probe again, already finding the anatomical landmarks, the space between the radius and the ulna, the line where she would cut. "We perform emergency fasciotomy now, or we explain to a decorated soldier why he came back from Kandahar with 2 arms and left Mercy General with 1. You're a nurse." "Yes." "You don't have surgical credentials." "No." She had surgical training that predated her nursing license by approximately 12 years and 800 hours. She had performed this exact procedure on a Marine named Thompson while lying in the dust of a collapsed building with insurgent rounds snapping overhead like angry insects. She had done it left-handed because her right arm was broken. She had done it in 30 seconds while Thompson screamed and she told him over and over, stay with me, I've got you." She had been 26 years old and wearing Master Chief Petty Officer rank insignia and calling herself something else entirely. But that woman was dead. The government had buried the records. Mosul had buried the witnesses. "Get me a scalpel," Elena said. "I'm opening the anterior compartment. Marcus, get the fascial retractor. I need visualization." The room went very quiet. "Elena," Dr. Chen said. "I'm calling security." "Call them," she said. She was already making the incision, precise, controlled, the blade moving through skin and tissue with a kind of economy of motion that comes from doing something so many times that your hands remember the way. But in about 90 seconds, this patient's hand is going to lose perfusion. His fingers will start turning black. And you're going to have to explain to his commanding officer at Camp Pendleton why you chose protocol over keeping a ranger's arm. The scalpel hissed through tissue. Real sound. Not metaphorical. Blood welled up, and she had the suction catheter in position before the blood could obscure her view. The anterior compartment fascia lay beneath, the thick, unyielding membrane that had been strangling the muscle tissue. She could see the pressure in the tissue already, the way it was being crushed by its own swelling. "Scalpel," she said, and Marcus handed her a fresh one without asking why. Some instinct in the younger nurses recognized authority when they heard it, even wrapped in a woman's voice, even coming from the smallest person in the room. She made the second incision, opening the deep peroneal compartment. The pressure released like air from a balloon. The tissue underneath was pale where it should have been pink, starting to turn that particular shade of death that meant the clock was running and had been for several minutes already. "Fasciotomy scissors," she said. Marcus had them ready. The room smelled like blood and antiseptic and the particular metal tang that meant surgery was happening under emergency circumstances, the smell of adrenaline and the knowledge that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this man kept his arm or spent the rest of his life as an amputee. Elena cut the fascia in a line from one end of the incision to the other, releasing the pressure, allowing blood flow to return to the crushed muscle tissue beneath. She could feel Dr. Chen standing behind her shoulder now, not moving, just watching. She could feel Marcus holding the retractor with absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when a junior nurse realizes they are watching something they are not supposed to understand. "O2?" she asked. "Coming back up," Marcus said. Relief was starting to creep into his voice. 86. 88. 92. Heart rate was dropping. Blood pressure stabilizing. The hand at the end of Captain Holland's arm was starting to pink up again, the color of returning life, the color of fingers that might actually move again someday. The color of a career that wouldn't end in a hospital bed with a prosthetics appointment 3 doors down. Elena didn't smile. She had learned long ago that smiling was not part of who she had become. "We'll need orthopedic closure," she said to Dr. Chen. Her voice was already going back to soft, to invisible, to the particular tone of a nurse who has overstepped and is trying to fold herself back into the wallpaper. "The surgeon can handle it. But the compartment's decompressed. The tissue's viable." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Chen's pager went off. He looked at it. His face did something complicated, a kind of flash across his features, like someone realizing they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to be able to explain. "That was the surgeon," he said quietly. "He's here." 2 minutes. Elena was already moving the trauma shears back to the paper towel dispenser, rinsing them, wrapping them in the cloth from her pocket. The cloth that had been carrying them inside her scrub top, against her ribs, close enough to her heart that it had warmed to skin temperature. "You'll want to document what just happened," Dr. Chen said. "Before the next shift comes on." Elena nodded. She understood. He was giving her a grace period. A moment to decide what story this was going to be. A moment to choose whether she was the nurse who saved the patient or the nurse who broke protocol. She returned to her locker after her shift ended at 6 in the morning. The trauma shears went back into their cloth, back into the darkness at the very back, beneath the work shoes and the spare compression stockings and the photograph of the Marine who had married her the year before he deployed to Kandahar and the year before he didn't come home. She didn't know that Dr. Whitfield was already reviewing the incident report from Trauma Bay 3. She didn't know that his mind was already working through the implications. A nurse who had performed a surgical procedure, a violation of Section 12.4 of the hospital bylaws, a documented pattern of insubordination that he had been very carefully fabricating for the past 3 weeks. She didn't know that she had just given him the weapon he needed to take her down before she could connect the $30,000 discrepancy in the surgical equipment orders to his kickback arrangement with Apex Medical Solutions. All she knew, as she locked her locker and walked into the San Diego morning where the rain had finally stopped and the sun was just starting to think about rising, was that the Marine in the photograph had worn a call sign that meant death. That she had worn that same call sign across 3 continents. And that neither of them were supposed to be in a hospital saving the lives of people who would never know what they had cost to train. The trauma shears stayed wrapped in their cloth, warm against her ribs, as she drove home in silence. Thursday morning at Mercy General started like every other Thursday morning, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, the ER smelling of antiseptic and the faint metallic bite of blood that never quite washes away. Elena had been there since 6, running supplies, checking monitor calibrations, moving through the corridors like water finding the lowest place. The junior nurses didn't look at her anymore. That had started 2 weeks ago, right after Captain Holland. She was restocking the crash cart in Bay 3 when the overhead speaker crackled. Dr. Whitfield's voice came through the intercom, smooth as diesel fuel, all hands rounds. Room 12. 5 minutes. Elena closed the crash cart and walked toward the conference room where the medical students and junior RNs were already gathering. Whitfield stood at the head of the group like a man who'd never felt doubt, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a general's insignia. He saw her enter and his smile sharpened into something with teeth. Nurse Martinez. Perfect timing. He gestured for her to stand in front of the group. Since you've been studying our supply chain so intently, I'm curious about your pharmacological foundation. Let's do a quick case study. Elena's jaw tightened but she said nothing. Around her, 3 medical students and 2 junior nurses shifted their weight. One of them, Sarah, fresh out of BSN school, stared at her shoes. A 64-year-old female, septic from a perforated bowel. Whitfield's voice took on the theatrical patience of a teacher addressing a slow child. Lactate elevated, refractory hypertension despite 2 liters of fluid bolus. You need sedation for intubation. Propofol or midazolam? Midazolam, Elena said quietly. Propofol tanks BP in septic patients. Midazolam preserves perfusion pressure. Whitfield's smile didn't change. He stepped closer. Wrong time frame. The patient's been hypotensive for 90 minutes. Try again. Then push epi first. Her voice remained level. Get the pressure up, then midazolam is safe. Are you guessing or do you actually know? He let the question hang in the air like a scalpel. Because your chart notes suggest you're more comfortable with clerical work than pharmacology. Elena felt 8 eyes on her, the weight of judgment from people who'd been trained to respect the pecking order. She could feel her pulse in her temple but her face gave nothing. Propofol causes myocardial depression and reduces SVR by 30 to 40%. In sepsis, that's irreversible. Midazolam is safer even without pressors, but adding vasopressor support first reduces the risk further. Adequate. Whitfield turned to the group, leaving the word hanging like a blade. Barely. See how complicated it is when you step outside your lane. He gestured to the med students. This is why we have hierarchies, people. This is why nurses observe and doctors decide. he spent the next 8 minutes grilling her on progressively obscure protocols, the ratio of oxygen consumption to carbon dioxide production in ARDS, the difference between Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter sepsis profiles, the hemodynamic effects of levosimendan versus milrinone. Elena answered each one correctly while the junior nurses stared at their feet. When she finally gave the last answer, Whitfield smiled and said, "Adequate." Barely, for the second time, and dismissed everyone back to their stations. Sarah passed her in the hallway an hour later and didn't meet her eyes. 2 days went by like that. Elena moved through the ER like a ghost in scrubs, drawing labs, checking lines, existing in the space between the living and the watched. On Saturday morning, she opened her locker on the 3rd floor and froze. The metal door hung slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, her gym shoes, her spare scrubs, her forgotten energy bar from Tuesday, all still there. But someone had pried the lock and written across the inside of the door in thick permanent marker, "Scarface." The letters were crude but deliberate, each one a small violence. And her trauma shears were gone from their hiding place in the back, now sitting in plain view on top of her folded scrubs like a calling card. Elena stared at them for 3 seconds without moving. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't water. She simply reached into the locker and gathered the shears in one palm, feeling the weight of them, 9 ounces, engraved with a call sign that belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She wrapped them back in their cloth and tucked them into her jacket pocket. Then she closed the locker door on the vandalism and walked to the water fountain, where she got a paper cup, filled it, and drank with her eyes on the middle distance. By Monday, Whitfield had escalated from theater to infrastructure. Elena was summoned to his office at 1,400 hours. She knocked twice and entered to find him sitting behind a desk that cost more than her monthly rent, a manila folder positioned in front of him like a playing piece. "Sit," he said without looking up. "She's Saturday." Whitfield opened the folder and turned it around so she could see the pages inside. "I've been documenting some behavioral concerns," he said, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than his clinical lecture voice. "Failure to follow chain of command. Inappropriate tone with supervising physicians. Concerning fixation on administrative matters outside nursing scope. Insubordination. Do you want to read them?" Elena scanned the pages without picking them up. Her name. Her shifts. Dates of incident she'd never been told about. Write-ups she'd never signed. The handwriting was Whitfield's, she recognized it from the supply order annotations she'd seen him mark. The margins carried his comments, small and vicious. "Thinks she's too smart for her role. Challenging my authority, pattern of behavior. Recommendation, remedial training and probationary status." He slid a pen across the desk. "I'm recommending 90 days probation pending your completion of a hospital-approved refresher course on scope of practice and professional hierarchy. Sign here acknowledging receipt." Elena picked up the pen and signed without reading further. She understood what this was, the paper trail, the alibi. Whitfield was building a case. She could see the architecture of it now, the clinical ambush, the elevator intimidation, the locker vandalism. Each one small enough to dismiss. Together they painted a portrait of a nurse who was unstable, insubordinate, beyond the bounds of her role. She slid the pen back across the desk and met his eyes for one steady second. She saw something flicker in his expression, a moment where he seemed to expect her to speak, to protest, to give him something to use. Instead, she simply stood and turned toward the door. "We're not finished," Whitfield said. "Yes we are," Elena said quietly, and walked out. That same afternoon, the ER scanner crackled with the tone that made everyone stop moving. Incoming trauma. Army Ranger training accident. Compartment syndrome developing. Male, 28 years old. ETA for minutes. Elena was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1, her hands muscle memory and pure instinct. The scanner gave vitals, BP 118/72, heart rate 96, oxygen sat 97, but they didn't matter because the compartment syndrome told her everything. The fascia was strangling the muscles, blood flow cut off, and she had approximately 10 minutes before permanent tissue death became irreversible. She pulled 14-gauge angiocath needles. Prepped the bay. Checked that the fasciotomy tray was stocked with the proper instruments. The bay filled with the smell of open supply packages and the sound of her own breathing, steady and even. Around her, 2 nurses and a resident moved in practice synchronization. The monitor hummed its baseline. Everything was ready. Then the automatic doors opened and the gurney crashed through with the precision of a military insertion. Captain Ray Holland was seizing, his lips the color of old bruises, his right forearm swollen to twice its normal size and hard as wood. Elena could see the compartment syndrome written in the tension of his skin, the way his fingers had started to curl inward from lack of circulation. Fasciotomy, now, she called out, moving to his right side. The resident, Dr. Chen, who wasn't scheduled but had come in anyway, was already moving to get into position when Whitfield's voice cut across the bay like a scalpel. "Martinez, you are not authorized. We wait for Dr. Chen." "Dr. Chen is here," Elena said, still focused on the ranger's arm. "I said step away from the patient." She paused. She turned. Whitfield stood at the entrance to the bay with his arms crossed, his face composed in an expression of absolute authority. Behind him, the main ER had gone quiet. People were watching. "That's a direct order," Whitfield said, his voice steady and certain. "Step away or I'll have security remove you and add insubordination to your file." For 5 seconds, Elena stood with her hands hovering over Captain Holland's arm. She could feel the weight of the trauma shears in her jacket pocket, the cloth wrapped around them like a confession. She could feel the weight of everyone watching. She could feel the weight of the man in front of her, confident in his institutional power, in his ability to say words that mattered, in his understanding that she had no authority here, no credential, nothing but the knowledge that 10 minutes from now this man's arm would be dead tissue. But that wasn't the worst part. The phone call came at 1432 hours. Elena was restocking the trauma bay when the ward secretary found her, voice pitched low. Dr. Whitfield wanted to see her in his office. Now. She knew what this meant. She'd been expecting it for 3 days. The corridor to administrative offices smelled like carpet cleaner and expensive cologne, the kind of place where decisions got made by people who never saw blood. Her boots clicked against linoleum, each step deliberate and measured. Composure. Nothing showed on her face. Nothing ever did. Whitfield's office was all mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Diego's harbor. He sat behind his desk like a man posing for a photograph, one hand resting on a manila folder so thick it looked like it weighed 5 pounds. The folder was the color of old bone. "Close the door, Elena." He didn't use her first name often. The formality was a weapon. She closed the door and stood. Not sat, stood. Never give him the satisfaction of making you comfortable in his space. "I've been documenting a concerning pattern." Whitfield opened the folder with the deliberate slowness of a man savoring an audience. He pulled out page after page, each one stamped with official letterhead, each one bearing dates and times and her name. Failed to follow chain of command. Insubordination during rounds. Unauthorized deviation from protocol. Failure to defer to senior physician authority. Elena scanned the pages without touching them. She recognized none of it. The dates were real: Thursday, the day of rounds. Friday, the day after the locker. But the incidents were fabrications, each one constructed with surgical precision. A moment she'd remained silent and that silence had been reinterpreted as disrespect. A procedure she'd anticipated and prepared for, now framed as overstepping her scope. Words she'd never spoken, attributed to her in neat clinical language. 2 inches of manufactured insubordination. 2 inches of a paper trail designed to look airtight. "These are fabrications," Elena said. Her voice was level, empty of inflection. Like someone reading a grocery list. "Are they?" Whitfield leaned back, fingers steepled. "I have timestamps. I have witnesses, several of my colleagues who were present during your defiant behavior. I have documented evidence that you repeatedly disregarded my direct instructions. He tapped the folder like it was a winning hand in poker. You understand what this means. The hospital board reviews personnel files monthly. When they see a pattern of insubordination spanning multiple weeks, with corroborating documentation from attending physicians, there's only one decision they can make. Elena understood perfectly. This wasn't humiliation anymore. This was architecture. Strategic, methodical, competent. He'd stopped yelling. He'd stopped the locker vandalism and the elevator theatrics. He'd moved into the realm of institutional power, the kind that didn't require his voice to be loud, just his paperwork to be thick enough. I didn't write any of these reports, Elena said. No. Whitfield smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd already won. I did. As chief attending, I have that authority. These reflect my professional observations of your conduct. They're entirely appropriate for the permanent record. He closed the folder with a soft thud. The board meets Thursday. I'll present these findings. I expect you'll be terminated before end of business. The room was very quiet. Even the harbor sounds outside seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Elena thought about Captain Holland. She thought about his arm, about the compartment syndrome compressing muscle and nerve and blood vessel, about the 8-minute window before irreversible tissue death began. She thought about the emergency fasciotomy that would save his life if someone with knowledge performed it. If someone who understood trauma medicine stepped in. If Whitfield didn't stop her. You're constructing a case, Elena said. Not a question. I'm documenting reality, Whitfield replied. You're documenting fiction. With institutional weight behind it. Whitfield stood, gesturing toward the door with the casual arrogance of someone who'd already dismissed her from his office and from her career in the same motion. That's a matter of perspective, Elena. And in this building, my perspective carries more weight than yours. Always has. Always will. Unless you have something actually documented, some evidence of your own, this goes to the board Thursday. And they will believe me. Elena walked to the door. She could feel the weight of the man behind her, confident in his institutional power, in his ability to say words that mattered, in his understanding that she had no authority here, no credential, nothing but the knowledge that soon enough, when a critical patient arrived with compartment syndrome, there would be a ticking clock and she would be ordered to stand aside and watch. She reached for the handle. Her hand paused against the cold metal. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? Whitfield's voice carried the satisfied smugness of a man who thought she was thanking him for the advance notice. For making your strategy transparent. Elena opened the door. For choosing paper over competence. For believing the board matters more than patient outcomes. She left his office without waiting for his response. The walk back to the ER felt longer than it had coming. Her mind was already moving through contingencies, through possibilities, through the reality that she would be fired before Thursday if he accelerated the timeline, and possibly during Thursday if the board voted the way his carefully constructed file suggested they would. She had perhaps 72 hours before institutional power crushed her completely. 3 days before the woman named Elena Martinez, the nurse, the ghost, the person with no past and no future, became officially unemployable. But that wasn't the worst part. The ER had been chaos when she left, a multiple vehicle accident on I-5, ambulances rolling in at 15-minute intervals, every trauma bay occupied. When Elena returned, the controlled burn of a busy trauma center had become something else, an emergency announcement crackling through the intercom at 1,443 hours. Incoming trauma. Army Rangers. Training accident with crush injury. ETA 8 minutes. Her hand knew before her mind caught up. She was already moving toward the supply lockers, already cataloging what she'd need, for lines, blood products, monitoring equipment, the standard array of trauma resuscitation tools. And then her fingers found something in her locker that shouldn't be there. Her trauma shears. The ones engraved with Reaper 6 along the blade. The one someone had stolen during the vandalism. The ones that had been returned in silence, placed back in her locker by someone who understood what they meant and wanted her to have them. She held them for 1 second. Just one. Whitfield appeared at her shoulder like a shark catching blood in the water. Put those away. They're not your responsibility anymore, remember. Elena didn't answer. She simply moved to the trauma bay, the shears tucked in her scrub pocket next to her badge, and waited for the Rangers to arrive. The ambulance crew brought him in at 1,450 hours. Captain Ray Holland, vital signs deteriorating, left arm swollen to twice normal size, skin stretched and mottled purple. Compartment syndrome. The kind of injury where muscle was dying inside an intact fascial sheath, where pressure was building toward critical levels, where every minute without decompression meant permanent damage or amputation. Crush injury from a training apparatus, the paramedic reported, rattling through vitals. BP 118/72, heart rate 104, respiratory rate 22. Compartment pressure estimated significant based on clinical exam. He's been down for 40 minutes. Whitfield stepped forward, taking the lead. Get him on a monitor. Type and cross. I'm calling up to OR to schedule a fasciotomy. Etta? Elena asked quietly. 20 minutes. Maybe more. She did the math in her head. 40 minutes of pressure. 20 more minutes in the ER before anyone with surgical authority could intervene. Holland would be at 90 minutes total. The research was clear: fasciotomy beyond 90 minutes of compartment syndrome meant tissue death. Meant amputation. Meant a Ranger captain spending the next 50 years learning to live without an arm. She looked at Whitfield. He met her eyes and saw exactly what she was thinking. Don't even consider it, he said. Low, controlled, the voice of a man issuing a command he expected to be obeyed. That's an OR procedure. You step in and you're finished. Not Thursday. Today. I will have security escort you out of this building before Holland even reaches the elevator. Elena pulled the trauma shears from her pocket. Write whatever you want, she said. She moved to Holland's bedside without waiting for a response. The captain's eyes were glassy with pain, consciousness fading toward shock. Elena's hands were already moving, already preparing the arm, already assessing the swelling, already knowing exactly where the fascial compartments needed to be released. The first incision was clean and controlled, skin parting like water, revealing the purpled muscle beneath. The fascial sheath came next, tight as a drum, releasing a hiss of air as she cut through it. Muscle bellied out, engorged with stagnant blood and cellular fluid, immediately turning darker as decompression allowed circulation to resume. Second compartment. Third compartment. Each one methodical, each one the work of someone who'd done this in a forward operating base in Mosul with nothing but a field trauma pack and the understanding that the next 10 minutes were the difference between a soldier coming home whole or coming home broken. She's performing an unauthorized surgical procedure. Whitfield's voice was sharp, clinical, documenting. She could hear him on his phone, words becoming a recording. Nurse Martinez is performing an unauthorized surgical procedure in violation of Section 12.4, timestamp 1,447 hours. I have ordered her to stop and she has refused. I am documenting this with multiple witnesses. The ER staff froze. Some moved to help, instruments passing, for fluids running, the automatic choreography of trauma medicine. Others backed away, afraid of association, afraid of standing next to someone who was committing professional suicide in real time. Elena's hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed controlled. Pain was information, and the information her hands were giving her was clear. Holland's compartments were releasing. Blood flow was returning. Tissue was being saved. When Dr. Chen arrived from OR at 1,454 hours, he examined the work without saying anything at first. His eyes moved over each compartment, assessing the incisions, the technique, the results. Then he looked at Elena. This was textbook, he said quietly. Who did this? Before Elena could answer, Whitfield stepped forward. She did. Without authorization. In direct defiance of my orders. I have documented the entire incident and witnesses who can corroborate her insubordination. I want her badge and a security escort out of this building immediately." Elena set down the trauma shears. As she placed them on the instrument tray, several staff members saw the engraving clearly for the first time. Reaper 6. The letters were small but visible, caught in the overhead lights, impossible to miss once you knew to look for them. Nobody asked what those letters meant. Captain Holland's vitals stabilized. His color began returning. His arm, the one that was supposed to be tissue dead, the one that should have required amputation, was saved. Across the trauma bay, Elena could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, the dawning awareness that something significant had just happened, that something about the quiet nurse and her engraved shears didn't add up to the institutional narrative Whitfield had been constructing. But none of that mattered anymore. She'd saved the arm. She'd also sealed her termination. Whitfield had his documentation. He had his witnesses. He had his case already built, and now she'd added the final brick, proof of direct insubordination, recorded by the attending physician himself, performed in front of half the ER staff. Elena walked to her locker, gathered her personal items, a photograph, a change of clothes, the spare badge she'd kept since orientation, and waited for security. Security arrived at her locker at 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Elena didn't look up. She removed the photograph of her husband, James in Dress Blues, 2009, Fort Lejeune, and placed it face down on the shelf. The guard stood 6 feet away, arms crossed, watching her movements like she might explode. She might have. She didn't. The trauma shears lay where she'd left them after Holland's surgery. Stainless steel, engraved on the handle, Reaper 6. 2 symbols of who she wasn't allowed to be anymore. She stared at them for 8 seconds, the guard shifted his weight, then left them on the shelf. To take them would be theft. To leave them was surrender. Both felt identical. "Ms. Martinez, you need to vacate the premises." The guard's voice carried the careful distance of someone following a script written by people who feared her, though they didn't know why. She nodded and closed the locker door with a soft click of a coffin lid. The hospital board had convened at 2:15 p.m. in Conference Room B on the 3rd floor. Elena hadn't been invited. Dr. Whitfield had presented his documentation, 42 pages of fabricated insubordination reports spanning 6 weeks, each one backdated with clinical precision. Clinical quizzing incident. Insubordinate demeanor. Disregard for physician authority. Pattern of escalation. And finally, the one that sealed everything, emergency fasciotomy performed by non-surgical staff, Section 12.4 violation, immediate risk assessment warranted. The board had deliberated for exactly 42 minutes. Elena knew the duration because the union representative, a exhausted woman named Sandra Ortiz, had told her in the hallway afterward. "They said the numbers looked bad," Ortiz said, not meeting her eyes. "The pattern, I mean. They said it suggested you were becoming a liability." "Did they mention the patient's arm?" Elena had asked. They did. But Whitfield argued that the ends don't justify the means. That procedures exist for reasons. That if everyone bypassed protocol when they thought it was necessary, the hospital would collapse into chaos. Ortiz had looked at her then, shame flickering across her face. "I argued. I told them the patient would have lost his limb. They said it was an outlier. They said the pattern was what mattered. The pattern. 42 pages of nothing. 42 pages of a man's career obsession." Elena walked down the corridor toward the elevator. The fluorescent lights buzzed their monotonous hymn. At 3:54 p.m., she passed the trauma bay where Captain Holland had arrived 6 hours earlier, seizing and blue-lipped and bleeding into a compartment that would have devoured his arm in minutes. The on-call surgeon had been 20 minutes away. Elena had made the calculation, the same calculation her hands had made 1,000 times in Mosul, the same cold mathematics of survival. Pain was data, blood was pressure, time was measured in tissue death. She had opened her locker. Retrieved the shears. Retrieved muscle memory that belonged to someone who didn't exist anymore. The emergency fasciotomy took 4 minutes. Elena made the incision from the lateral knee to the ankle, following the anterior compartment of the tibia, releasing the pressure that was crushing Holland's tissue into necrosis. The smell of copper and antiseptic. The hiss of pressure releasing. Holland's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 71 to 78 to 84 as his arm received blood flow again. Dr. Whitfield had stood 3 feet away, documenting everything on his phone camera. Recording. Building. Weaponizing. The elevator doors opened. Elena stepped inside. An intern she didn't recognize stood in the corner, eyes down, phone clutched like a shield. He didn't look at her. No one looked at her anymore, and now there was a reason. What floor? He asked, not meeting her gaze. Lobby, Elena said. The doors closed. The elevator descended. At the 3rd floor, it slowed, and Elena felt the weight of institutional machinery grinding toward one conclusion. They had fired her to protect a man who was stealing from them. They had sacrificed her to preserve a system. They had chosen the pattern over the patient, the policy over the limb, the bureaucracy over the basic mathematics of staying alive. The elevator doors opened onto a basement level. A man stood there in a dark suit, holding a file folder. He was thin, with the kind of posture that came from spending 30 years in rooms where conversations couldn't be recorded. He stepped inside. The doors closed. "We need to talk," he said. His name was Marcus Webb. They'd never been introduced, but Elena knew his voice. He was the handler who had given her the order 18 months ago. "Master Chief Martinez is dead. The operation was buried. You received a medical discharge. You are Elena Martinez now, civilian. You are no one." "I know what happened," Webb said quietly. Section 12 point for violation. Pattern of insubordination. "I've read his file." "It's fabricated," Elena said. "Yes. It is." Webb opened the folder and showed her 42 pages of Whitfield's handwriting, each report dated and stamped and calculated like the work of a man who understood that paper left trails. "But it doesn't matter. You can't fight this. Master Chief Martinez doesn't exist. If you go public with your identity, if you tell them who you are and what you did in Mosul, you compromise everyone still in theater. You gave your word." Elena said nothing. "I know this is," Webb paused, searching for a word that wouldn't contain a lie. "I know this is unacceptable. I'm working with some people. But you have to stay quiet. You have to let this happen." "Captain Holland lost his arm," Elena said. "I would lose him." "I know," Webb said. And the elevator doors opened onto the lobby. The parking lot was 86 degrees, with the kind of San Diego heat that felt like judgment. Elena walked to her truck, a 2014 Ford F-150 in primer gray, and sat in the cab without turning on the engine. She didn't cry. The trembling wasn't fear. It was rage so complete and so controlled that it had turned into a vibration at the cellular level, a hum that only she could hear. At 7:41 p.m., Elena drove north on Interstate 5 toward Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. The sky was turning the color of old bruises. The radio played something about second chances, and she turned it off. The headstone was white marble, 2 feet tall, set into the grass like a wound that had healed wrong. Captain James Martinez, USMC, 1981 to 2017, beloved husband. Below that, a rank insignia she wasn't allowed to acknowledge anymore. A name she wasn't allowed to say out loud. An identity that had been buried deeper than the classified operation that killed him. Elena knelt in the grass. The rain started at 8:03 p.m. Not the San Diego mist but real rain, the kind that hammered and didn't apologize. "I couldn't even hold on to this," she whispered. "I can't be her. I can't be anyone. I failed." The rain fell. The headstone stayed cold. And somewhere in the city, Dr. Whitfield was sleeping soundly, his file complete, his pattern established, his victory secured. He didn't know he was standing on a fault line. He didn't know what he'd just done by firing a woman who had carried Marines through kill zones, who had coordinated airstrikes under fire, who had spent 12 years learning how to survive things that shouldn't be survivable. The groundskeeper found her at dawn, still kneeling, the rain having stopped 3 hours earlier. He didn't speak. He just left a thermos of coffee on a bench and walked away. Elena didn't touch it. She stayed there as the sun rose over San Diego, as the day began its bright indifference, as her phone remained silent in her pocket, waiting for 3 days. At 6:14 a.m. on Saturday, a man was transported to Mercy General's Trauma Bay via ambulance. Gang dispute. Gunshot wound. Tourniquet applied in the field. Blood loss at rate of approximately 400 milliliters per minute. The ER staff was already 3 trauma cases deep when he arrived, already screaming, already bleeding through the sterile sheets before they could even get him to the bay. Elena wasn't scheduled. Elena wasn't employed. Elena was at home, staring at her reflection in the dark television screen, when her phone rang. It was Sandra Ortiz. "You need to come in," she said. "Right now." "I was fired," Elena said. "I know. But there's a patient. Iraqi national. He's in your trauma bay screaming something in Arabic that I don't understand, and his oxygen is dropping, and he won't let anyone near him until," Ortiz paused. "Until he sees you." Elena hung up. She drove her truck to Mercy General at speeds that would have earned her a ticket if anyone had been watching. She parked in the staff lot instead of visitor parking, a choice, a message. She walked through the ER doors at 6:47 a.m., still in her civilian clothes, still fired, still nobody. The trauma bay was chaos. The man on the stretcher was in his late 30s, dark hair, the kind of face that carried weight. He was pale from blood loss, tourniquet high on his right thigh, oxygen at 14 liters per minute and his saturation still dropping. At 88. Falling. He was screaming something in Arabic that made the ER staff step back, made them hesitate, made them uncertain. "Malak al-Mort," he screamed. "Malak al-Mort! Malak al-Mort!" Elena walked to the bed. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and his screaming stopped. His face crumpled. He began to weep. "It's okay," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, her hands already moving toward the tourniquets. "I'm here." She didn't hear the doors open. She didn't hear the boots on the tile. She didn't hear the sound of 40 men in dress uniforms arriving at exactly 6:51 a.m., didn't hear Captain Holland's crutches hitting the floor as he moved toward her, didn't see the rest of the Ranger Battalion filtering into the trauma bay, forming a perimeter around the surgical field like an honor guard at a funeral. She was focused on the patient. On the bleeding. On the numbers. But that wasn't the worst part. Or the best part. Or the part that changed everything. The gunshot wound arrived at 2:47 a.m. Mercy General's trauma bay doors hissed open and the stretcher came through like a torpedo, paramedics calling out vitals, 32-year-old male, GSW to the left abdomen, BP 98 over 60, 2 units en route. The patient was conscious. The patient was screaming. Elena stood at the medication cart 3 bays down, restocking 4 lines. She didn't look up at first. Just another Friday night in San Diego, just another body broken by violence, just another life balanced between the ER floor and oblivion. She'd seen 14 trauma cases this week alone. The city bled through every shift. Then the screaming changed. It became words. Arabic words. Malak al-Mort. Malak al-Mort. Angel of death. No, no, no. Her hand stopped moving. The 4 line hung suspended between her fingers. Around the ER, nurses exchanged confused glances. Dr. Chen, the night attending, was already moving toward the trauma bay, confused but focused on the job. The patient thrashed against restraints, eyes rolling wild with morphine and panic. "Malak al-Mort, you came for me, you came." Elena set the 4 line down on the cart. She could feel every eye in the nursing station turning toward her. Feel the weight of recognition beginning to build in the fluorescent-lit space the way pressure builds in a storm system. She walked toward the trauma bay. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of walk that suggested she already knew something everyone else was about to discover. The patient's eyes locked onto her face and he went absolutely rigid. You're her. His voice cracked like breaking ice. Master Chief. The trauma bay went silent. Not the normal silence of an ER. Not the background hum of ventilators and monitor beeps continuing their mechanical rhythm. This was the silence that happens when the world pivots on a single hinge and everyone feels it swing. Dr. Chen's hands froze over the patient's abdomen. A young surgical resident blinked twice, processing what she'd just heard. The trauma team looked from the patient to Elena and back again, watching equations recalculate in real time. Elena didn't flinch. She moved to the patient's bedside, checked his vitals on the monitor, scanned his wound site with the clinical eye of someone who had held lives together in places where hospitals didn't exist. "You're safe," she said quietly. "You're at Mercy General. You're getting surgery in 4 minutes." The patient grabbed her hand. His fingers were ice and trembling. "You saved us. In Mosul. You saved us and we thought you were, we thought," tears spilled down his face. "You're real. You're actually real." Before Elena could respond, before she could say anything that might make this worse or better, the ER doors erupted like a dam breaking. They came through in formation. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 20, 50. Army Rangers in dress uniforms, spit-polished and precise, moving through the ER with the coordinated flow of a unit that had trained together for years. The lead man was Captain Holland. His left arm was still in a sling from the fasciotomy Elena had performed 90 hours ago, the emergency surgery that had saved his limb and destroyed her career. He moved straight to her. "Master Chief," he said. Not a question. A salute delivered in words. Behind him came a medic Elena recognized, one of Holland's team. His name was Garrett. She'd pulled him 2 miles through Mosul streets under sniper fire in 2011. He'd been bleeding out from a leg wound and she'd talked him through shock the entire way, kept him awake, kept him breathing, kept him alive. He saw her now and his hand went to his chest like he was trying to stop his heart from coming out of his ribs. "Oh my God," he said. "Oh my God, it's you. It's actually you." Behind Garrett came the battalion chaplain, a silver-haired man named Father Mitchell who Elena had never met but who carried a tablet with him. He moved to the center of the ER, and without asking permission, without waiting for protocol or hierarchy or any of the small rules that govern hospital spaces, he began to read aloud. His voice carried the weight of official record. "Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, JSOC Task Force Designation Reaper 6, Unit Citation for Extraordinary Valor in Mosul Province, October 2011. During sustained direct contact with insurgent forces, Master Chief Martinez established and maintained a defensive perimeter for 40 minutes while coordinating medical evacuation of 12 Marines. Under continuous fire. Alone." The chaplain's voice didn't waver, but tears were streaming down his face. Around the ER, nurses and doctors stood frozen in the space between 2 worlds, the civilian world they inhabited and a world of classified operations and call signs and the kind of heroism that didn't get announced at morning briefings. Then a man in a dark suit appeared. Elena didn't recognize him at first. He was older, maybe 60, with the bearing of someone used to moving through secure facilities. He moved directly to Elena and extended his hand. When she shook it, his grip was firm and respectful, and he said very quietly, "CIA Commendation. December 2011. Black Ops Extraction. Your handler said you'd want to know it's being declassified." The words hung in the ER like a charge of electricity. Every face turned toward Elena. Every single person in that trauma bay now understood that the woman who'd been fired 3 days ago for violating hospital protocol, the woman who'd mopped that same ER floor with quiet dignity while they whispered about her scars, was not who they thought she was. She was not even who she'd been allowed to be. Captain Holland stepped forward and drew himself to attention. Then he saluted. One by one, every ranger in that ER came to attention. 40 soldiers in dress uniform rendering military honors to a woman in scrubs standing in the fluorescent glare of Mercy General's trauma bay, 3 days after the hospital had terminated her, in a space that had become the opposite of sacred but was, in that moment, being treated like holy ground. The man in the dark suit simply nodded. "You're cleared to return to active duty if you choose to." He left a card on the medication cart. It had no name, just a phone number. "When you're ready." Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they began to leave. But not before Garrett gripped Elena's shoulder hard enough that she felt it through bone. "You came back for us," he said. "Thank you." The ER doors closed behind the last ranger. The trauma team stood in stunned silence. The Iraqi insurgent was already being wheeled to surgery, muttering Malak al-Maut, over and over like a prayer that had been answered. Dr. Chen looked at Elena. Then he looked back at his trauma team. Then he said, "Someone get me a status update on that GSW. And someone call administration. Tell them we need to have a conversation about how we treat people in this hospital." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the ER came back to life, but something fundamental had changed in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum, but underneath it was a different frequency entirely. What happened next didn't happen at Mercy General. It happened on a much larger stage. By morning, the videos were already viral. Someone had uploaded security footage from the ER, the Rangers, the salute, Elena standing in the center of it all with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having already survived the worst. The clip was titled "Fired Nurse Revealed as Decorated Navy Master Chief" and it spread across military networks like wildfire. 4 million views by noon. 8 million by evening. Every veteran subreddit. Every military Facebook page. News outlets picking it up. Local San Diego stations running the story. Former soldiers and sailors and Marines sharing it with captions, "This is what we do to our heroes." But that wasn't the catalyst. That wasn't what ended it. At 0800 the next morning, Dr. Marcus Whitfield's phone rang. His hands were shaking when he picked it up, because he already knew. He'd seen the videos. He'd watched the comment section fill with people identifying him, shaming him, his name attached now to a narrative of cowardice. The voice on the phone was old, measured, and cold in a way that made the line feel like ice. "This is Dr. Raymond Chen. I was your mentor at Johns Hopkins. I trained you 20 years ago." The old man's breath came in controlled, furious pulses. "I just watched you bully a Silver Star recipient in an elevator. I watched you block her exit while you lectured about hierarchy. I watched you treat someone who's saved more lives than you've signed prescriptions for like she was beneath your notice." Whitfield's jaw clenched. He said nothing. "I will spend every remaining day of my life ensuring no one forgets I trained a coward," Dr. Chen continued. "You're done, Marcus. Your career is done. I'm going to make sure of it." The line went dead. Within 2 hours, Dr. Chen had called the hospital board directly. Then the state medical board. Then every colleague in his network, surgeons and department heads and medical school professors who could make phone calls that opened records and asked questions that couldn't be ignored. By that evening, the hospital board had launched a full review of Dr. Whitfield's tenure. By that evening, administrators were pulling file after file, cross-referencing orders, discovering the supply requisitions that didn't add up, the vendor relationships that were just slightly wrong, the kind of financial trail that Elena had noticed weeks ago and had been trying to protect people from. $30,000 in fraudulent orders. Kickbacks from a medical equipment company. Falsified requisitions. All of it documented. All of it discoverable because the same paperwork Elena had flagged, the work that had made her dangerous to him, now became the evidence of his guilt. By the end of the week, Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat in a hearing room in a suit that no longer fit quite right. A board of physicians and administrators sat across from him with folders open, expressions grave. He tried to defend himself. He cited policy. He cited precedent. He cited the fact that everyone does it, that the margins are normal, that he was simply being a good steward of hospital finances. They didn't care. His license was suspended pending investigation. His credentials were stripped. His employment was terminated. Security escorted him out past the ER where staff stood in clusters, watching. The locker still had Scarface written on it in permanent marker, but someone had surrounded it with flowers. Dozens of flowers. And a printed sign that read, in letters large enough to see from the hallway, Master Chief Martinez, hero. Whitfield saw it and looked away. He kept looking away as he walked through the ER doors for the last time, his dignity following him like a ghost that couldn't quite catch up. 6 months later, the world had rearranged itself into different shapes. Elena stood in a new office on the 4th floor of Mercy General, the lettering on the door reading Director of Veterans Trauma Services. The hospital had created the position specifically for her after the board had issued a formal apology and the Navy had quietly begun the process of acknowledging her service record, not all of it, not the classified portions, but enough. Enough to let her exist as both Elena and Master Chief. Enough to let her be whole. On her desk sat a shadow box containing the trauma shears engraved Reaper 6. Beside it was a photograph of Captain Holland walking out of rehabilitation on 2 strong legs, moving with the easy precision of someone who'd been given back the thing he thought was lost forever. The image had been taken last month. He'd written on the frame, "Because you didn't let me down." Across the city at the VA hospital in Mission Valley, Dr. Marcus Whitfield pushed a mop across linoleum floors. His scrubs were pale blue. His name tag read M. Whitfield, custodial. He emptied trash cans and cleaned bathrooms and mopped hallways where veterans received the care he'd once been paid to deny them. A Marine in a wheelchair rolled past him yesterday and thanked him for keeping the floor clean. Whitfield couldn't meet his eyes. That morning at Mercy General, Elena conducted rounds with her new trauma team. A surgical resident, 2 combat medics, a Navy corpsman, and a nurse who'd been with Elena since the beginning. The young resident asked about the scars on Elena's forearms. The ones that mapped years. The ones that told stories. Elena paused. She looked at her hands like she was seeing them for the first time. Then she said, "They're a map of everyone I couldn't save. And everyone I could. Both matter. Both made me who I am." She turned to the team and said, "Let's go. We've got 3 patients waiting, and I promise you, the work we do in this trauma program is going to change how this hospital treats people." That's not a promise. That's a guarantee. As they moved down the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Elena's ID badge caught the light and gleamed. Under her name and title, Master Chief, RET, Elena Martinez, there was a small plaque. The words were engraved in brass, and as she passed, someone could have read them if they looked closely enough. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If you're watching this and you work in healthcare, in law enforcement, in any field where people sacrifice pieces of themselves for people they'll never know, thank you. And if you've ever been underestimated, ever been dismissed for something that wasn't about your skill or your character, keep going. The people who matter will see you eventually. Share this video. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes hiding in plain sight. And comment, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were?